High above the clouds at 35,000 feet, Dominic Rourke, the notorious CEO of Solara Dynamics, reclined in his leather seat aboard a lavish private jet. A half-filled bourbon glass dangled from his hand as he cast a smug glance across the aisle. Opposite him sat Alina Cross, calm and composed in a sharply cut slate-gray suit, a folder of documents open on her lap, a fresh cup of coffee steaming gently beside her. "Looks like they're letting just anyone on my jet these days," Dominic slurred, his voice soaked in arrogance before hurling the contents of his glass across the aisle, splashing Alina's face. She blinked, dabbed the liquid from her cheek with a napkin, and let a faint, unbothered smirk tug at the corner of her lips as he chuckled darkly. The calm crackle of the intercom cut through the awkward tension. "Ms. Cross, the captain would like to see you in the cockpit." Dominic's grin froze. "Why her? What the hell was going on up front?" The jet hummed beneath them, a sleek, pressurized haven of wealth wrapped in dark walnut paneling and butter-soft leather. 15 passengers filled the cabin, executives and their assistants from Solara Dynamics, sipping champagne, scrolling through quarterly briefs, draped in the comfort of elite privilege. Dominic Rourke, 52, sprawled arrogantly near the front. His crisp white shirt was half unbuttoned, his thick fingers wrapped around a sweating glass. Bloodshot eyes locked onto Alina, who hadn't moved. She sat upright, posture perfect. Her espresso skin shimmered under the dimmed lights. She didn't flinch, didn't wipe the whiskey from her suit, already doing that calmly seconds earlier. Her fingers remained on the edge of her coffee cup. Her stack of files rested untouched. Dominic wasn't finished. He leaned forward, voice loud and sharp enough to pierce through every whisper in the cabin. "You don't belong here," he snapped, dripping venom. "What's next? Letting the janitors sit with the executives?" Some executives exchanged uneasy glances. Others chuckled quietly, eager to stay in the good graces of their powerful, volatile boss. Dominic slammed his glass onto the tray table, the clatter echoing like a pistol shot. "This is my plane, my world. You're stinking it up. Go clean something. That's probably more your speed." The cruelty of his words hung in the pressurized air like smoke. A few rows back, Reed Dalton, 31, a junior analyst with nervously shifting eyes and sandy hair, coughed awkwardly into his fist, his face flushing red. Tension swelled. Eyes darted. Everyone waited. Would Alina break? She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, her dark gaze slicing through Dominic with unsettling calm. She lifted the napkin one last time, dabbed her cheek, and folded it neatly before placing it on the tray beside her. "Fascinating," she said coolly, her voice smooth as silk. "I didn't know a corner office came with that much insecurity." Her tone didn't rise, but it carried. "Must be exhausting," she added, "knowing the only reason you're up here is because Daddy gave you the keys." A ripple of muffled laughter floated through the cabin. Reed's eyes widened, a grin tugging at his lips. A silver-haired VP, Estelle Drayton, 60, let out a small cough, clearly masking a chuckle. Dominic's face went dark, jaw clenched. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. She'd touched a nerve. He rose, fast and furious, towering over her with his 6'2" frame. "You've got a lot of nerve speaking to me like that," he snarled, finger jabbing. "I don't care what sob story got you on this flight. You're out of your depth. Somebody get her off my damn jet." He turned toward the flight crew. 3 attendants huddled near the galley in sharp Navy uniforms. "You!" he barked, pointing at the youngest, Sophie, a 20-something with wide eyes and blonde hair pulled tight into a bun. "Tell the pilot she's gone. Now." Sophie hesitated, glancing at her colleagues. The other 2, Leo, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses, and Marta, a statuesque woman with a stern face, shared an uncertain glance. But none of them moved. The passengers sat frozen. Some leaned in, others sank back, unsure which way this would swing. Alina crossed one leg over the other, brushing an invisible speck from her knee as if Dominic's tantrum were elevator music. "You might want to sit down," she said, her tone dry, almost disinterested. You're embarrassing yourself. I'd hate to see you trip over that ego when we land." A louder chuckle slipped from Reed Dalton's throat, cutting through the tense silence like a spark on dry brush. Across the aisle, Estelle Drayton quickly raised a hand to her lips, shoulders trembling in barely contained laughter. Even Leo, the wiry flight attendant, bit his lip, his eyes flickering with a suppressed grin. Dominic Rourke's head snapped around, his glare locked on Reed like a lion catching a twitch in the tall grass. "You think this is funny, Dalton?" he barked, stomping down the aisle like a storm in a suit. "You're done. Fired. Pack your little intern briefcase when we land." "I don't need jesters in my company." Reed's face drained, his voice catching in his throat. "Sir, I didn't mean—" But Dominic silenced him with a dismissive flick of the wrist, already pivoting back to Alina Cross, chest rising and falling with the high of his power play. "You see that?" he said, pointing a shaking finger back at Reed, who sat stunned, crumpled. "That's what happens when someone challenges me. I am this company. And you?" His voice dropped into a cold, cruel sneer. "You're just a bug I'm about to squash." He tugged his tie straight and slicked back his thinning hair with a trembling hand. As the adrenaline faded, a smug grin crept back onto his face. The cabin went still. The quiet, momentarily alive with defiance, now wilted under Dominic's icy stare. Some of the execs gave weak nods, returning to their scripts, their champagne, their comfort zone. Sophie, the youngest flight attendant, crept forward hesitantly. Her voice shook. "Mr. Rourke, I'll speak to the captain." She turned on her heel, shoes clicking quickly as she disappeared toward the cockpit. Alina watched her go, then leaned back and folded her arms with a practiced calm. "Wow," she said, her tone edged with steel. "A whole performance, just to prove you're terrified of a woman who's already outplayed you." Dominic's smirk twitched. His eyes narrowed. What did she mean by that? Before he could speak, Reed found his voice again. "She's right, you know," he said, shaky but standing his ground. "You're not leading, you're just bullying." The words landed with a quiet thunder. A ripple passed through the cabin. Estelle shifted in her seat and gave a slight nod, her lips pressed thin. Around them, whispers stirred, soft, growing, like wind before a storm. Dominic turned back to Reed, his expression twisting into something dark and unhinged. "You're begging for it, kid," he snarled, stomping back toward him. "You want to play hero? I'll bury you next to her." He loomed over Reed, the young man shrinking under his weight, courage fading. The other passengers looked away, pretending to study the clouds through the windows, the air thick with fear. Dominic straightened up and turned his glare on Alina. His voice dropped, low and venomous. "You think they're with you?" he hissed. "Watch this." He stormed toward the cockpit, barking loud enough for the whole jet to hear. "Captain! Divert! Find the nearest dump of an airstrip. We're dropping this trash off where she belongs." Each word was a slap, calculated, brutal, dehumanizing. The jet tilted slightly as it banked, the cabin lights shifting as the intercom crackled. "Mr. Rourke adjusting course. ETA to alternate landing. 40 minutes. Dominic beamed, folding his arms as he returned to his seat like a king reclaiming his throne. "See?" he said, loud and clear. "My plane. My rules. You're gone, sweetheart." Marta, the senior attendant, appeared at his side with a fresh glass of whiskey. Her expression was tight, uncomfortable, but she said nothing. Dominic took a long drink, eyes locked on Alina with smug satisfaction. Around them, the passengers settled again. Some nodded quietly, resigned. Others stared out at the stars, pretending none of this existed. Reed slumped, hands clenched in his lap. His earlier fire dimmed. Alina? She didn't so much as blink. She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and fixed her gaze on Dominic. "Keep digging," she said softly, barely louder than a whisper. But her voice carried a weight that landed squarely in his gut. "You're going to love the hole you've made." That smirk was back, the same one that had haunted him moments before. It told him she was calm for a reason, that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a mistake. Dominic's grip tightened on his whiskey glass. The liquid sloshed as he fought the flicker of fear rising in his chest. What game was she playing? Near the galley, Sophie whispered urgently to Leo, her voice trembling. The executives murmured, uncertain, their eyes flicking between the icy woman in gray and the unraveling CEO. The jet soared on, slicing through the darkness. But inside, the air had changed. He leaned back, forcing a hollow chuckle as if to shake off the shift he couldn't quite name. He had the plane, the people, the power. Didn't he? But Alina's eyes never left him. Sharp, steady, unforgiving. And for the first time that night, Dominic Rourke felt the cold shadow of doubt creep into his spine. He raised his glass in a mocking toast, his voice booming with smug self-importance. "To the top dogs," Dominic Rourke declared, shooting a wink at Estelle Drayton, who didn't return the smile. The jet banked harder, descending toward whatever dusty strip he'd rerouted them to. Dominic lounged back, drowning in false confidence, unaware of the storm brewing right across from him. Alina Cross's smirk hadn't faded. If anything, it deepened, a quiet, surgical promise that this wasn't over. The cabin buzzed with a restless, charged energy. With 30 minutes left before landing at Rourke's mystery exile spot, the polished wood paneling and plush leather seats began to feel less like luxury and more like a pressure cooker. 15 passengers sat stiffly, executives, assistants, and one rattled Reed Dalton, whose jaw still ached from being verbally blindsided. Their eyes flickered between Dominic and Alina like spectators stuck between fear and fascination. Dominic clutched his second whiskey of the hour, the glass slick with condensation, his grin growing with every sip. He'd just ordered the pilot to dump Alina mid-flight, and the crew hadn't questioned him. That made him feel untouchable. Across the aisle, Alina still sat pristine, her gray suit crisp, her now empty coffee cup set neatly on the tray beside her. The whiskey he'd thrown earlier had dried, but the insult lingered. And yet, she didn't flinch. Her files remained untouched. Her eyes didn't waver, and it drove Dominic crazy. He leaned forward again, voice rising to dominate the cabin. "Enjoy your last few minutes in the big leagues," he mocked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Because once we touch down, I've got security waiting to drag you off my jet. Should have stuck to fetching coffee instead of sipping it." The words dropped like bricks, heavy, designed to crush. A few executives nodded, numb from years of appeasing him. Estelle, meanwhile, stopped writing. Her pen froze mid-sentence. Reed sat quietly, fists clenched in his lap. His face burned with a mix of shame and anger. Near the galley, the crew huddled, Sophie, Leo, and Marta, whispering tensely. Sophie's hands shook as she clutched a tray, her wide blue eyes darting nervously to Alina, then away. Dominic snapped his fingers in Leo's direction. "You! Get me the satellite phone!" he barked, calling in my head of security. "This nobody gets cuffed the second we touch down." Leo hesitated, his jaw flexed. He didn't move. Marta, standing stiff beside him, gave him a hard nudge, and Leo reluctantly shuffled to a side compartment and retrieved a bulky black device. Dominic yanked it from his hands with flair, punching in a number while never taking his eyes off Alina. "Yeah, Trent," he said loudly once the line connected. "It's Rourke. Got a situation. Woman on my jet doesn't belong here. Black, about 38, acting like she owns the place. I want a team waiting on the tarmac. Arrest her for trespassing the second we land." He ended the call with a theatrical thud, tossing the phone onto the tray table, then turned back to Alina with a grin. "Did you hear that? That's the sound of your fantasy ending. Hope the coffee was worth it." The cabin tilted as the jet dropped through turbulence. Overhead, bins rattled. Passengers grabbed their armrests, but Alina didn't move. Calm as ever, She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. With one smooth flick of her wrist, she opened it. The overhead lights caught a glossy ID card. Her name, her title, the gold seal of Solara Dynamics shining back. "I'm not trespassing," she said, her voice a quiet blade. "I'm on business." "Your business. Maybe you should check your manifest before summoning the cavalry." The words landed with force, measured and irrefutable. Reed's head jerked up, a spark of hope in his eyes. Estelle leaned forward, squinting at the badge. Even Sophie's tray dipped as her mouth parted in surprise. Dominic's grin vanished, his face flushed with blotchy red. He lunged forward, snatching the ID from Alina's hand. His thick fingers smudged the plastic as he stared at the card. "This is fake," he growled, but his voice cracked, unsure. He shoved the badge toward Leo. "Verify it, now." Leo fumbled with the phone, his voice hushed as he spoke to someone on the other end. The tension returned like a vacuum. Everyone sat frozen. Even the engines seemed quieter. Finally, Leo looked up, his face pale. "It's real, sir," he said. "She's on the active consultant list, hired last month." Leo handed the ID back to Alina Cross, who accepted it with a calm, deliberate nod, then slipped it into her blazer like a queen returning a checkmate piece to its box. Dominic Rourke's jaw clenched so tight his teeth audibly ground together. With a sharp motion, he slammed his whiskey glass onto the tray table, amber liquid splashing over the rim. "Fine," he hissed, his voice low and acidic. "You've got a shiny badge. Doesn't mean you belong here." He flicked a hand at the crew in dismissal. Leo retreated to the galley without a word. Marta followed, her scowl deepening. Sophie lingered a moment longer, her wide blue eyes flicking toward Alina, part awe, part relief, then hurried away. The cabin murmured with restrained tension. Some passengers exchanged nods, acknowledging Alina's poised takedown. Others whispered, their eyes darting between her and the CEO, who had just lost all footing. Reed, still shaken, straightened slightly in his seat, a hesitant grin forming. "She got you good," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Dominic to hear. Alina met Dominic's glare without flinching. Her smirk returned, sharper now, more dangerous. "You're digging your own grave," she said, her voice smooth and quiet, slicing clean through the awkward silence. "But go ahead, keep swinging. It's one hell of a show." Laughter, soft, cautious, spread through the cabin. Estelle's pen scratched rapidly across her notepad, her eyes sharp with interest. Dominic narrowed his eyes, blood pulsing in his ears. She had dodged the arrest, undermined his authority, and now had the cabin swaying in her favor. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. He leaned forward, his voice a venomous whisper only she could hear. "You think you're slick? Enjoy it while it lasts." Then, while Alina turned slightly to gather her files, Dominic moved. His hand slipped into his briefcase. Quiet, intentional. He pulled out a small metallic object, a pocket knife with a sleek silver handle. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slid it into the side pocket of Alina's bag, nestled deep between her documents. Hidden. His lips curved into a subtle, sinister smile as he leaned back again, raising his whiskey for another sip. "Let's see how smart you are when they find that," he murmured, his tone soaked in malice. The jet jolted slightly through a rough patch of turbulence. The cabin lights flickered briefly, but Dominic barely noticed. His confidence had begun to return. He'd set the perfect trap, and this time she wouldn't see it coming. Around him, the mood lightened. Passengers resumed their conversations. Reed leaned over to Estelle, whispering, "She's tougher than he is." Estelle gave a small nod, lips pursed with a hint of admiration. The crew returned to their routines. Sophie poured water for a nervous executive. Leo wiped down the counter, eyeing Dominic warily. Alina flipped open a file and began scribbling notes, completely unaware of the danger now hidden inches from her. The air in the cabin seemed lighter. less tense. Executives chuckled softly, exchanging glances with Alina. Her calm had flipped the tone. Her unshakable composure had turned Dominic's tantrum into a punchline, but Dominic's smirk lingered as he tapped his fingers against the armrest in slow rhythm. He may have lost the room, but he'd rigged the game. There was now a knife in her bag, and once they landed, once security searched her, it wouldn't matter what she said. Trespassing was one thing, a concealed weapon was another. He took another long sip, savoring the burn in his throat as much as the thought of her downfall. She might have dodged arrest once, but this time he'd bury her. The jet continued its descent, engines humming steadily. Through the windows, faint lights twinkled below, the backwater landing strip now just minutes away. Dominic leaned back, eyes glinting, whatever secrets she carried, whatever power she thought she had. He would make sure they never saw the light. The threat of arrest hung in the air like a noxious cloud. 15 passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing between Dominic Rourke, sprawled with fresh whiskey in hand, and Alina Cross, seated across from him, composed and unshaken in her still crisp gray suit. Dominic's smugness had returned full force. A sly gleam danced in his bloodshot eyes as he nursed his drink, his fingers brushing casually against the armrest, just inches from the hidden knife he'd planted in Alina's bag. That pocket knife, now tucked into the side of her briefcase like a coiled snake, sat waiting. Another jolt rocked the plane. Overhead, bins rattled from turbulence, but Dominic's grin only widened. He'd lost the last round, sure, but this one? This would be his knockout. Down the aisle, Sophie, the young blonde flight attendant, walked carefully with a tray of water, offering a glass to a visibly nervous executive. Her eyes flickered toward Alina's bag, then away again, quickly. She felt something. Dominic caught her glance and sat forward, his voice slicing through the hum of the engines. "Hey, Blondie," he said, loud enough to make heads turn. "Check her bag. I don't trust her sitting here with the rest of us decent folks." His words dripped with venom, a dog whistle loud and clear. The energy in the cabin shifted again. Estelle Drayton, Reed Dalton, and others who had begun to relax after Alina's confident ID reveal now froze in place. Sophie stopped in her tracks, her tray tilted, a glass sliding dangerously close to the edge. "Sir?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Dominic waved his hand impatiently. "You heard me," he snapped. "She's hiding something. I can feel it." Alina tilted her head slightly, her deep brown eyes narrowing as she studied his latest move. She didn't reach for her bag, didn't flinch. She let the tension stretch, let the moment grow uncomfortable. Near the galley, Leo and Marta exchanged glances. Leo shrugged, his wiry frame taut. Marta gave Sophie a curt nod. With trembling hands, Sophie placed her tray down on an empty seat, then stepped hesitantly toward Alina's bag. The entire cabin went quiet. 15 pairs of eyes locked on Sophie's hands as she slowly unzipped the side pocket. Then came the gasp. She drew out the small, sleek pocket knife, its folded blade gleaming under the cabin lights. "Oh, my God," Sophie whispered. She dropped it onto Alina's tray table with a sharp clatter. Dominic shot to his feet, towering in the aisle, his voice booming like thunder. "What the hell is that?" he roared, pointing at the knife like it was a ticking bomb. "A weapon? On my plane? She's a damn terrorist!" The word struck like a match tossed into dry leaves. Panic erupted. Estelle clutched her pen, knuckles white. Reed's jaw dropped, the fire in his eyes replaced by raw shock. A balding exec, Philip Raines, muttered "Jesus" under his breath. A young assistant named Clara shrank into her seat, eyes wide. Dominic spun toward the flight crew, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Call security! Lock her up! She's a threat to every one of us!" His accusations came fast, each one sharper, uglier than the last. "I knew it. People like her, sneaky, dangerous, waiting to stab us in the back." The cabin turned chaotic. Philip shouted, "Get her off the plane!" Clara whimpered, clutching her purse. Even Estelle, who had chuckled earlier at Alina's confidence, now hesitated, her pen hovering, unsure what to write. Sophie backed away, hands shaking. Leo bolted for the satellite phone, dialing quickly. Marta stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Everyone stay in your seats. We're handling it." But her eyes darted between Alina and Dominic, unsure who the real threat was. The plane dipped again, descending fast. The landing strip's scattered lights blurred through the windows, now just 5,000 feet below. Dominic paced the aisle like a predator, feeding on fear. "This is what happens when you let them in," he spat, his gaze sharp with hatred. "They don't belong with us. They never will." But Alina didn't rise. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She sat back calmly, crossing her legs, her hands resting lightly on her knees. "Nice try," she said, her voice slicing through the chaos like cold steel. "But that's not mine." She reached forward, lifted the knife with 2 fingers like it was roadkill, and held it up for the cabin to see. "This is a prop. Used it in a client demo last week. Titanium alloy, blunt edge. Couldn't cut butter." She pressed the blade against her own palm and dragged it slowly. No blood, no mark. Gasps rippled through the passengers. Some leaned in, squinting. Others stared in stunned silence. Dominic's triumph soured on his face. "Bull!" he snapped, lunging toward the tray. But Alina calmly pulled her hand back, then dropped the knife onto the tray table with a quiet clink. Clink! "Check the serial number," Alina Cross said coolly, nodding toward Leo, who still held the satellite phone in a tight grip. "It's registered to Solara Dynamics R&D department," she added, tapping her stack of files. From it, she pulled a single sheet, crisp, official-looking. "Here's the purchase order, dated 10 days ago. It was for a security tech demo." Leo took the paper, scanning the lines with careful eyes. He looked up and gave a slow nod. "She's right," he muttered, then handed the document to Marta, who squinted at the page, frowning as the weight of the truth settled in. The tide had turned. Reed Dalton, still pale from the earlier humiliation, pulled out his phone with a steadier hand. "I'm recording this," he said firmly, lifting the camera to capture Dominic Rourke's expression, the flushed cheeks, darting eyes, and twitching jaw. "You planted that, didn't you?" "Tried to frame her?" A ripple ran through the cabin. Passengers murmured in disbelief. Estelle Drayton set her pen down at last, her voice low but razor-sharp. "That's low, Dominic, even for you." Philip Raines crossed his arms, disgust overtaking the earlier fear. From behind her purse, Clara whispered to a colleague, "He's losing it." The crew stepped back instinctively. Sophie clutched her tray like a shield. Leo and Marta exchanged a look, the kind that said, "We backed the wrong horse." Dominic's chest heaved, his fists clenched tight as he glared across the aisle at Alina. "You think you're clever?" he hissed, voice trembling with rage. "This isn't over." But it was clear his trap had backfired, and the cabin knew. Alina met his stare, her smirk widening. Not smug, but surgical. "Keep going," she said, her tone nearly playful. "You're making this too easy." The jet dipped lower, landing gear whined as it locked into place, signaling the final descent. Whispers died down. Support for Alina solidified in the still air. Reed kept filming, the red light blinking steadily, capturing every crack in Dominic's unraveling facade. But Dominic wasn't out of moves. Not yet. As the plane leveled out at 2,000 feet, he slipped a hand into his jacket pocket. A small remote, sleek, discreet. His fingers tapped it with precision. A silent command triggered deep in the jet system. From the vents above, a faint hiss, subtle, easily missed, began to spread. No one noticed. Dominic leaned back, a dark smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Let's see how you handle this," he muttered, sipping the last of his whiskey. His eyes never left Alina. The cabin lights flickered once, then steadied. 1,000 feet now, the runway glowed below like a ghost. Alina calmly flipped open another file, her pen dancing across the page. Oblivious, Reed lowered his phone slightly, leaning toward Estelle. "She's unstoppable," he whispered. Estelle nodded. Her earlier doubt had melted into something close to admiration. The crew prepared for landing. Sophie stacked trays with shaking hands. Leo moved through the aisles, checking belts. Marta locked the galley, but Dominic's fingers drummed the remote in his pocket like a war drum. The sabotage was working, slowly. The oxygen levels inside the cabin had begun to drop, just a little, just enough to cause chaos. And when it hit, he'd point the blame at Alina. Frame her again, this time as a threat to everyone's safety. The jet's descent steepened, engines roaring louder. Dominic sat still, waiting for the storm to erupt. He'd lost the crowd once. But this fall, this one was going to crush her. The sabotage Dominic had set minutes ago was now tightening its grip. The first sign came softly, a faint hiss escaping from the vents above. Masked by the engine's roar, it went almost unnoticed. Sophie, the blonde flight attendant, paused mid-step, her tray of empty glasses wobbling. She frowned up at the ceiling. Near the galley, Leo, ever alert, cocked his head, a crease forming between his brows. Marta, unbothered, adjusted a passenger's seatbelt, oblivious to the growing danger. Dominic leaned forward suddenly, his voice slicing through the cabin's lull. "What's that smell?" he barked, loud enough to jolt the passengers. "Something's off. Check it now." His tone danced between mock concern and hidden glee, his eyes darting to Alina Cross. Around him, the cabin began to stir. Estelle Drayton looked up from her notes. Reed Dalton gripped his phone tighter, the camera still rolling. Philip Raines sniffed the air, his face twisting in unease. Then it hit. With a loud snap, yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like eerie marionette strings. Red lights began to strobe. An alarm shrieked through the cabin. Panic took hold. Clara screamed, clawing at a mask. Philip fumbled with his, hands trembling. Estelle stayed composed, sliding on her mask with practiced ease, her eyes sharp and locked on the chaos. Reed's phone clattered to the floor as he grabbed his own mask, voice muffled and panicked. "What's happening?" Sophie's tray hit the ground, glass shattering across the aisle. As she rushed to help Clara, Leo bolted toward the cockpit, shouting over the din, "System failure!" Marta barked orders, her unshakable demeanor cracking as she tried to fit a jammed mask on a coughing exec. Dominic stood, his towering frame commanding the aisle, but his own mask hung around his neck, untouched. He didn't need it. He knew what was happening. "It's her!" he roared, jabbing a finger at Alina. "She's sabotaging my jet. I told you she's a threat." His accusation poured gasoline on the panic. Philip yanked off his mask, face crimson. "She's killing us!" he shouted, lunging toward Alina. Clara sobbed, "Do something!" Even Estelle hesitated, her pen slipping from her hand. The crew froze, caught between Dominic's command and their own judgment. The jet lurched again, another 1,000 feet lost in seconds. Altitude gauge blinking, 19,000, 18,000. Head spun, lungs struggled. But Alina didn't flinch. With fluid motion, she slipped on her oxygen mask. Her deep brown eyes scanned the chaos with deadly calm. "He's lying," she said, her voice firm through the plastic. Then she moved. She brushed past Philip's flailing arms and strode toward the galley, her steps sure, controlled, even as the floor tilted beneath her. Dominic's eyes widened. He hadn't expected action. "Stop her!" he barked, shoving Sophie aside as he lunged after her. But Alina was already at the panel. Near the sink, a discreet hatch. She yanked it open. Inside, a mess of wires and a blinking red LED, the heart of Dominic's sabotage. Her fingers flew, years of engineering experience rising to the surface. She traced the connections, found the override switch. "Amateur," she muttered. She flipped it. Click. The hiss stopped. Fresh oxygen surged through the vents. The alarm fell silent. The red lights dimmed to green. Passengers gasped, masks fogging with renewed breaths. Clara slumped in her seat, tears running down her cheeks. Philip sagged with relief, his chest rising and falling. Estelle adjusted her mask, her gaze now locked on Alina with fierce respect. Reed picked up his phone again, already filming. His lens captured Alina Cross, calm and victorious, standing beside the control panel like she'd just disarmed a bomb. Dominic's face twisted in horror. His perfect frame-up crumbled right in front of him. "No!" he roared, charging toward the galley. But Leo intercepted him, shoving him back with surprising strength. "Sit down, sir," Leo snapped, his wiry frame bristling with conviction. Marta stepped up beside him, her stern eyes daring Dominic to take another step. The jet leveled at 15,000 feet. Below, the dusty airstrip came into view through the windows, drawing closer. Dominic's sabotage had failed, and Alina had just saved them all. The outline of the remote landing strip sharpened through the dusk below as Alina Cross casually brushed her palms together, as if wiping off a speck of dust. "You really thought that would work," she said, her smirk slicing deeper than ever. "I've fixed tougher systems." Blindfolded. The passengers stared at her, their fear dissolving into awe. Then, breaking the stunned silence, Reed Dalton's voice rang out, shaky but full of conviction. "She just saved us." The cheers came like a slow-building wave. Estelle Drayton clapped first, 2 crisp slaps against her tray table. Clara wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding rapidly. Philip Raines muttered, "Holy hell!" His panic replaced by disbelief. Even the crew joined in. Sophie clapped, hands still trembling. Leo cracked a rare grin. Alina stood tall, her gray suit still pristine. Her files sat untouched but stacked perfectly behind her. She had taken Dominic Rourke's sabotage and turned it into her triumph. And now, the entire cabin knew it. Reed zoomed in, his camera catching Dominic's flushed, furious face, his confidence drowned in humiliation. Dominic slumped in his seat, the empty whiskey glass limp in his grip, his hands trembling. She'd beaten him again. Worse, she'd saved the very people he tried to manipulate. The cabin belonged to her now. But Dominic wasn't finished. His chest burned, his mind spun with desperation. 12,000 feet. Landing was minutes away. In everyone's eyes, he was a fool. But not in his own. He leaned forward, whispering low, just for Alina. "You're dead when we land." Her smirk didn't flinch, but her eyes hardened. She was ready. Dominic acted fast. While the crew ran final checks and Alina returned to her seat, he pulled out his phone. Opening a secure app, he typed a single coded message to his tech team on the ground. "Hijack comms. Fake distress call. Pin it on her. Now." He hit send. A low, vicious grin curled on his face. The jet dropped to 10,000 feet. Outside, the runway lights glared up from the desert. He'd lost the passengers, but he'd win the skies. A fake distress call was now in the system, transmitted to air traffic control. It named Alina Cross as a hijacker. Her word versus his, and his name still carried weight. He pocketed the phone, his confidence flickering back to life. She might have stopped the oxygen sabotage, but soon she'd be branded a national threat. The jet leveled at 8,000 feet. The cabin calmed. Passengers unbuckled their masks, laughter and low chatter bubbling again. Estelle leaned toward Reed, whispering, "She's a genius." Reed nodded, his phone still recording, the red light unwavering. Clara adjusted her ponytail, breathing easier. Philip leaned back, muttering, "Didn't see that coming." The crew resumed prep. Sophie swept up broken glass. Leo secured the galley. Alina, ever composed, sat down again. She opened her file. Her pen scratched calmly across the page. She had saved them all, turned Dominic's chaos into her crown. For a moment the cabin glowed with her victory, but Dominic was watching. And now his final card was in play. 6,000 feet, then 5. The landing gear hummed as it deployed. Alina didn't look up. Dominic did. His grin returned, darker now. He could feel it. His fake distress call had taken hold. Any second, they'd arrive. Fighter jets, the real show, 4,000 feet, the airstrip, a jagged scar below. Dominic leaned back in his seat, sipping the last bitter drops of whiskey. She'd played her hand, but his was still coming. The engines roared as the jet tilted gently in descent. 3,000 feet. She had saved the day, but he would make sure, absolutely sure, it would be her last. The jet sliced through the thick dusk, now at 10,000 feet again. Its engines growled steadily. Inside, the sleek velvet seats and polished oak surfaces shimmered in soft ambient lighting. 15 passengers sat still, their expressions worn from the chaos, but eyes fixed on Alina Cross. Oxygen masks hung unused. The worst was over, or so they thought. Dominic lounged with eerie calm, his fingers tapping an ominous rhythm on the armrest. The dark grin returned. Sharper now, fueled by the message he'd sent just minutes before. Across from him, Alina didn't blink. She sat straight, her gray suit perfect, her pen still moving, and then a sudden deafening roar tore through the calm. 2 F-16 fighter jets streaked past the windows, sleek, metallic bodies glinting in the dying light. The cabin jolted. Windows rattled. Clara gasped, pressing her face to the glass. "What is that?" she squeaked, her voice trembling. Clara squeaked, her voice trembling. Philip Raines, the balding exec, leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Military," he muttered, his earlier relief dissolving. Estelle Drayton set her notes aside, her sharp eyes narrowing. Reed Dalton raised his phone, resumed recording, the red light blinking steady as he captured the growing chaos outside. The intercom crackled. The pilot's voice came tight and clipped. "This is Captain Rhee. Air traffic control received a distress signal from our system. They think there's a hijacker on board." Dominic Rourke shot up, his towering 6'2" frame filling the aisle, face a mask of staged outrage. "It's her!" he barked, jabbing a finger toward Alina Cross. "She's the one I warned you about. Dangerous as hell!" His voice was a venomous flood, washing panic through the cabin. "She's a hijacker, a lunatic. Look what she's already done. Oxygen sabotage, and now this?" He spun toward the crew, Sophie, Leo, and Linda, his eyes wild. "Lock her down before she crashes us all!" Clara whimpered, clinging to her armrest. Philip nodded furiously. "She's out of control!" he shouted. Even Estelle hesitated now, her pen tapping nervously on her tray. The jet dropped to 8,000 FT, the 2 F-16s circling just beyond the windows, engines roaring like predators. But Alina Cross didn't blink. She calmly set down her pen, folded her hands in her lap, her dark brown eyes locking onto Dominic with unnerving calm. "You're good at this," she said, voice smooth and cold, but not that good. She stood, brushed her blazer, and strode toward the galley like she owned the air. Dominic's voice ripped through the cabin. "Stop her!" Sophie stepped aside, her tray clattering as she froze. Leo lunged, but Alina sidestepped smoothly. She reached the comms panel, the same one near the oxygen system she'd fixed earlier. Her fingers flew over the keys, eyes sharp. Passengers watched, breathless, as the jet dipped to $7,000 theft. Dominic shoved Linda aside, charging after her, fury twisting his face. "She's hacking it!" he bellowed. Alina twisted free, planted her stance. "Check the logs," she ordered, pointing at the screen. "Distress call, 5 minutes ago, sent from his phone." Her chin lifted toward Dominic. He froze, hand midair. Leo leaned in over her shoulder, scanning the data. "She's right," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's a fake, sent from inside the plane." Linda grabbed the satellite phone, dialing fast. "Captain, it's a setup," she said urgently. "Stand down the alert." The jet jolted, 6,000 FT. The F-16s maintained their orbit. Captain Rhee's voice returned over the speakers, calm but sharp. "Relay to ATC. Stand by." Dominic's face drained of color. His plan was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Alina turned to him, her smirk a blade. "You're running out of moves," she said. Then she stepped back to her seat. The cabin erupted. Reed's lens zoomed in on Dominic's stunned face. Estelle clapped once, sharp and clean. "Well played," she said. Clara let out a breath. "She's a genius." Philip slumped back. "He's finished." The crew rallied behind Alina. Leo nodded at her with respect. Sophie steadied herself, returning to the intercom. A buzz crackled. "ATC's clearing us," said Captain Ree. "F-16s are peeling off." The jets veered away, their roars fading into the dusk. Silence swept through the cabin. The jet leveled at 5,000 deployf. The lights of the landing strip appeared in the distance, a quiet, dusty beacon in the dark. Passengers broke into applause. Clara clapped softly. Philip joined in. Even Estelle cracked a rare smile. Reed kept filming. "She's unstoppable," he whispered. Dominic collapsed into his seat, his chest heaving. His plan, ashes, his frame-up, hacked. His sabotage, reversed. And the cabin? It belonged to Alina Cross now, but he wasn't done. Not yet. 4,000 FT'd landing was seconds away. He pulled a second phone, a burner, from his sock. With trembling fingers, he typed, "Emergency landing, rural strip, arm up, take her out." He hit send. A snarl curled on his lips. He'd lost the sky, but he still had the ground. A snarl curled across Dominic Rourke's lips as the jet neared its final descent. He'd lost the skies, but the ground? That was his turf. He'd summoned his private security, ex-military loyal to his wallet, and ruthless enough to clean up any mess. Alina Cross had outwitted fighter jets, sure, but she'd never see this coming. He slid the burner phone into his pocket, his grin sharp and jagged. She'd won the air, but he'd bury her in the dirt. The jet steadied at 2,000 feet, runway lights glowing like trapdoors waiting to spring. Alina sat calm, flipping open her files again, pen gliding in steady rhythm, unshaken, unstoppable. She had turned Dominic's chaos into her coronation, and the passengers basked in the afterglow. Estelle Drayton leaned toward Reed Dalton, voice low. "She's more than a consultant." Reed nodded, still filming. Clara tucked her hair behind her ear, her fear replaced with quiet awe. Philip Raines muttered, "He's a clown." The crew moved swiftly, Sophie securing the trays, Leo checking belts. Business as usual, but the tension still clung like static. The landing gear whined. 1,000 feet now. The airstrip stretched below like a dusty grave, and still, Alina Cross didn't flinch. Her calm cut through the cabin like gospel. The jet touched down hard, tires screeching across the cracked tarmac, clouds of desert dust swallowing the windows. Relief spread through the cabin like a soft exhale. Seatbelts unclicked, engines powered down, but Dominic's heart pounded. He leaned back in his seat, grinning like a mad king watching the guillotine fall. Just not on him. Outside, his men would be waiting. She'd save them all, but he would make her pay. Hey folks, what's your take? Comment 1 if you think Alina Cross is the ultimate badass who just outmaneuvered fighter jets. Drop a like if you're loving Dominic's spectacular crash and burn. Subscribe to follow every twist in this wild high-stakes showdown. Now buckle up. Dominic's got armed goons waiting outside. Will Alina walk into his trap, or does she already have a plan to flip this ambush upside down? Stay tuned. The jet's engines wound down, dust swirling outside in the amber haze of dusk. The once glamorous cabin, leather, oak, and gold trim, now buzzed with a tense energy, aftermath still crackling in the air. 15 passengers sat stunned. Oxygen masks hung loose. Fear and awe lingered in equal measure. Dominic Rourke slumped in his seat, his empty whiskey glass abandoned. His jaw tightened. His burner phone was still warm from the order he'd sent. The ambush was moments away. Alina Cross stood by her seat, her gray suit crisp, her expression unreadable as she stacked her files neatly. Her calm grated against his nerves like sandpaper. The jet's lights dimmed. The airstrip beyond the windows stretched out like an empty canvas until movement stirred the dust. Boots, heavy, coordinated. 5 figures emerged from the shadows. Black tactical gear, weapons drawn. Their leader, Vance, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar across his jaw, climbed the jet stairs like he owned the sky. His boots hit the cabin floor with thuds that made everyone flinch. "We've got a situation," he growled. His pistol was already raised. He pointed straight at Alina. "She's the threat. Step forward, hands up, or we start shooting." The passengers froze. Clara gasped, shrinking into her seat. Philip's face turned pale. Estelle's pen fell from her fingers and clattered on the floor. Reed Dalton scrambled for his phone, his hand shaking. Dominic Rourke shot up, triumphant. His booming voice filled the cabin. "I told you she was dangerous." He jabbed a finger at Alina, his eyes wild. "She's been playing you all. Oxygen sabotage, hijacking comms, now this." He turned to the crew. "Take her out." Dominic Rourke's voice dripped with venom as he barked through clenched teeth. "She's a thug, doesn't belong here." His sneer twisted cruelly as he turned to Vance. "Teach her a lesson she won't forget." Vance gave a curt nod. His team fanned out. 2 heading for the galley, 2 flanking the rear, all armed, all cold-eyed. Sophie, the blonde flight attendant, whimpered and dropped behind a seat. Leo and Linda, frozen near the cockpit, edged back, powerless against the armed force now stalking their cabin. Alina Cross didn't flinch. She calmly set her files on the seat beside her and turned her sharp, composed gaze toward the attackers. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice even and precise. She raised her hand, not in surrender, but in authority. A faint, unshakable smirk formed. "Those guns won't save you when this falls apart." Vance snorted and stepped closer, pistol inches from her chest. "Shut it," he growled. "Move, or you're done." The pressure in the cabin thickened. Outside, the Nevada airstrip lay silent. Inside, the storm raged. Dominic paced just behind Vance, chest puffed like a villain in a cheap suit. "I run this show," he thundered for all to hear. "You think you humiliated me up there? You're nothing down here." He leaned in, whiskey still on his breath. "This is where you learn your place." The armed men tightened their grip, boots scraping the floor. Clara sobbed softly behind her tray table. Philip Raines muttered, "Just do it." Even Estelle Drayton's resolve cracked, her pen trembling in her hand. The crew stood frozen. Then Alina moved, a blur of gray. She ducked beneath Vance's arm, her body fluid with practiced agility, and bolted for the galley. "Reed!" she called, her voice sharp as steel. "Cargo hold! Now!" Reed Dalton, shaken but alert, dropped his phone and chased after her. Vance whipped around, firing a wild shot. The bullet tore through the jet ceiling, sparks raining, screams erupted. Clara dove beneath her seat. Philip covered his head. Estelle ducked low. Dominic howled. "Get her!" The armed team charged. Alina reached the galley first, ripping open a panel near the floor. Cargo hatch controls. Her fingers flew across the buttons, working fast. Reed skidded beside her, eyes wide. "What now?" he panted. "Trap them!" She hit the final command. With a groan, the hatch opened, blackness yawning beneath the jet. Vance lunged, gun raised. But Alina yanked a fire extinguisher from the wall, blasting a thick cloud of white foam into his face. He staggered, coughing. Then she shoved him. He toppled backward, straight into the cargo hold. One by one, the others followed. Reed tackled one, a wiry man with a buzz cut, pinning him as Alina kicked away his pistol. It skidded across the floor. She snatched a tray from Sophie's cart and cracked it across another's face. He reeled, stumbling backward into the open hatch. The last two rushed her. She sidestepped, tripping one with a sweep of her leg. Reed shoved the other from behind. Thud! Thud! They were down. Then, clank. The hatch snapped shut, locked. Silence fell. The dust settled. Every passenger stared in stunned disbelief. Alina Cross, still in her gray suit, brushed off her hands, not a hair out of place. "That's handled," she said. She turned to Dominic, who stood frozen mid-aisle, mouth open, rage choking him silent. "You're running out of toys to break." Applause broke out. Estelle Drayton clapped first, sharp and deliberate, then Clara, her timid cheer trembling, but real. Philip let out a breath. "Unbelievable!" Reed grabbed his phone, hitting record again. The red light blinked steadily, catching Dominic's unraveling in real time. Leo and Linda emerged from the shadows, Leo nodding toward Alina. "You're insane," he said with a grin, admiration in every word. Sophie peeked out, hands shaking but clapping softly. Dominic Rourke's chest heaved, his fists clenched, his plan, his control, his narrative shattered. "You little—" Dominic Rourke lunged for her, eyes wild, but Linda stepped between them, her stance rigid, her voice like steel. "Enough!" she barked. He stumbled back, gasping, his grip on power slipping like sand through his fingers. The passengers rose around Alina Cross like a quiet army. Estelle Drayton stood, her notepad forgotten. Philip Raines crossed his arms, nodding. Clara wiped her cheeks, a shaky smile breaking through. Reed Dalton whispered into his phone camera, still filming, "She's a legend." Outside, the jet's door hung open, dust curling into the cabin from the desolate airstrip. But Dominic's armed team was gone, trapped in the hold, their weapons useless. Alina had flipped his ambush into her victory. The jet was hers again, but Dominic's rage festered. He slumped into his seat, fists clenched, mind racing. She'd outsmarted him at every turn, neutralized his security, turned the passengers against him, made him a fool. And they were cheering her like she was the damn hero. The engines were off, the sun had dipped, but Dominic wasn't done. He pulled out his burner phone one more time, hands trembling with fury. A new message. To Sheriff Hank Dawson. Subject, arrest warrant, assault on security. Use full force. He hit send. A twisted grin curled on his lips. Dawson was his man, paid, loyal, itching for a fight. She might have won the jet, but he'd bury her with the law. The passengers exhaled. Estelle approached Alina, nodding. "You're something else," she said, warmth breaking through her usual cool tone. Reed kept filming. Every second was evidence now. Clara smoothed her purse with a new kind of admiration in her eyes. Philip muttered, "He's got nothing left." The crew resumed movement, Sophie sweeping up shattered glass, Leo inspecting the cargo latch. Alina sat calmly, her pen gliding over a fresh file. She'd dodged bullets, outwitted guns, locked away the threat, and the cabin glowed with her win. But out beyond the jet, sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. Dominic leaned back in his seat, that cruel grin spreading. She escaped his brutes, but now the sheriff was coming, and she'd pay. The jet sat motionless on the dusty Nevada airstrip, its belly grounded in the twilight. Inside, the echo of victory pulsed like a heartbeat. But Dominic Rourke wasn't finished. Headlights pierced the fading dusk. Gravel crunched under tires. 3 sheriff's SUVs skidded to a stop beside the jet. 6 deputies stormed out, guns holstered, uniforms sharp. At their center, Sheriff Hank Dawson. Barrel-chested, silver badge gleaming, eyes narrowed under a sweat-stained hat. He climbed aboard, boots heavy on the jet floor. "Where's the suspect?" he barked, voice rough as gravel. Dominic shot to his feet, towering over the cabin once more. "There!" he roared, jabbing a finger at Alina. "She assaulted my security team, locked them up like animals. Arrest her, now!" Dawson's deputies spread out, boots thudding, hands twitching near their holsters. Clara shrank into her seat, trembling. Philip exhaled, the spark in his eyes fading. Estelle's hand tightened around her seat arm, her gaze flickering with doubt. Reed held his phone steady, the red light blinking, capturing every second. Sophie's tray slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. Leo's fists clenched, his jaw tight. Linda stood unmoving, but her breath had quickened. Dominic stalked behind the sheriff, his grin jagged and drunk with power. "She's a menace," he spat, each word a dagger soaked in venom. Dominic Rourke's words dripped with racial venom as he sneered at Sheriff Hank Dawson. "Think she can attack my men and walk free? Put her in her place." But Alina Cross didn't budge. She calmly set her pen down, folding her hands in her lap. Her deep brown eyes met Dawson's with a steady, unflinching gaze. "Your men drew weapons on us," she said, her voice sharp and resolute. "I defended myself and them." Her nod swept across the cabin toward the stunned passengers who now sat tense and conflicted. Dawson snorted, his hand twitching over his holster. "That's a real cute story," he growled, stepping closer. "But I've got 5 bruised boys in that hold who say otherwise. Hands behind your back. Now!" His deputies moved in. One unhooked a pair of cuffs from his belt, the cold metal catching the overhead lights. Dominic's chest puffed. His voice thundered like a judge handing down a sentence. "Law's on my side," he sneered, eyes locked on Alina. "You're done, sweetheart. Should have known your place." The passengers tensed. Clara whimpered. Philip Raines crossed his arms, seething. Estelle Drayton tapped her pen anxiously. Reed Dalton's camera stayed focused, capturing every flicker of cruelty on Victor's face. The deputies yanked Alina up, snapping the cuffs on with a loud click. She didn't resist. Her gray suit wrinkled slightly, but her calm never cracked. "This won't stick," she said softly, her voice a quiet dagger. Her eyes never left Dominic's. Dawson shoved her forward, deputies flanking her, their boots clapping down the aisle. "Move it," he barked, his voice thick with disdain. "Trash like you doesn't get to play hero." The slur landed like a punch. The passengers recoiled. Estelle's jaw tightened. Philip turned red with anger. Clara's eyes widened. Reed whispered to his phone, "Got that?" The red recording light blinked steadily. The crew stood frozen. Sophie wrung her hands. Leo slumped against the wall. Dominic followed the group with swagger, his grin wide as ever. Outside, the Nevada dust swirled as Alina was dragged toward a waiting SUV. Inside, the cabin was deathly still. The open doorway gaped like a wound. Dominic turned to the passengers, voice booming in triumph. "That's how you handle trouble," he said, smoothing his shirt. "She's gone, and I'm still here." He collapsed into his seat, his fingers brushing his burner phone, his trap nearly complete. But the air in the cabin had changed. Estelle shook her head slowly. "This isn't right." Philip muttered, "He owns the sheriff." Clara wiped her face, silent but furious. Reed never stopped recording. Outside, as Dawson shoved Alina against the SUV, she twisted just enough to catch Reed's eyes through the window. "Check my bag," she called out, her voice sharp over the wind. Reed blinked, then scrambled to her seat. His hands shook as he dug through the bag until he pulled out a silver USB drive. He plugged it into his phone. The screen lit up. An audio file, time-stamped. He hit play. Dawson's voice crackled. "Rourke's paying me double to lock her up. Don't matter what she did." The cabin fell into stunned silence. The passengers leaned forward, breath held. Reed turned the phone outward and cranked the volume. Estelle gasped, her pen falling from her grip. Philip's jaw dropped. Clara slapped a hand over her mouth. Leo surged forward, snatching the phone and replaying the audio. Linda's stern features hardened into outrage. Dominic's grin collapsed. He lunged. "Give me that!" he roared, but Leo blocked him, chest out. "Back off!" he snapped, handing the phone to Linda. She stormed to the jet's door. "Sheriff!" she shouted. "You've got a problem." Dawson stomped back up the stairs, face flushed, deputies close behind. "What's this?" he barked, grabbing the phone from her hand. The audio played again, his voice, his betrayal. His hand trembled, his eyes widened. With a snarl, he smashed the phone under his boot, the crack echoing through the cabin. "That's nothing," he growled, but the passengers weren't buying it anymore. Estelle rose, her voice crisp. "That's evidence." Philip nodded. "You're finished." Clara gave a tiny cheer. "She got you." Reed aimed his phone at Dominic, recording every second of his unraveling. Reed Dalton held up his own phone, his voice calm and clear. I backed it up. His grin cut sharp across the tension. Alina Cross stepped back into the jet, the deputies quickly removing her cuffs with tight, reluctant movements. Sheriff Dawson's face twisted, his authority crumbling before everyone. "Uncuff her," he muttered, the fire gone from his voice. Alina rubbed her wrists, her smirk sharper than ever. "Told you it wouldn't stick," she said, eyes drilling into Dominic Rourke. The passengers erupted. Estelle Drayton clapped first. Philip Raines quickly joined. Clara's cheer grew loud and unshy. Leo handed Alina her bag, his grin wide. Linda gave a firm nod, her eyes glowing with respect. "You're something else," she said. Dominic slumped back, chest heaving, sweat at his collar. Another trap shattered. She'd exposed his puppet sheriff and flipped his weaponized law into her leverage. The jet cabin, once his throne, was now hers. But Dominic's fury surged like fire. He yanked out his burner phone again, thumbs pounding the screen. "Leak the video, edit it, show her attacking us, nationwide drop." He hit send. His lips curled into a grin again, snake-like, vindictive. Sheriff Dawson retreated, his SUV convoy disappearing into the dusk. His power was broken, but Dominic wasn't done. He'd lost the jet, lost the passengers, but he'd burned down everything before giving up. Alina returned to her seat, calm, composed, her pen dancing across the page as if nothing had happened. The other passengers settled too, some whispering, some praising. Estelle leaned toward Reed, her voice warm. "She's incredible." Reed backed up more files, his hands steady. Clara beamed. But outside, beyond the cracked airstrip, a new storm brewed. Hours later, the chaos spilled into Los Angeles. Alina stepped through the neon buzz of the city, her gray suit still pressed, her files tight under one arm. The hum of the streets was nothing like the tension of the jet, but somehow it was worse. Dominic's latest strike had landed. A doctored video, spliced, blurred, saturated with dread, showed her smashing a tray into a guard's face. It looped endlessly across every screen, captioned, "Fugitive threat, armed and dangerous." The video was fake. But the panic was real. Hashtags trended. News anchors barked warnings. Police scanners buzzed her name. Somewhere in a luxury hotel suite miles away, Dominic watched it unfold. His fingers danced across his phone, basking in the destruction. His whiskey gone, but his spite growing. "Run all you want," he muttered, his voice a growl. "You're mine now." Back in the city, Alina ducked into an alley off Figueroa Street, the glare of police lights bouncing off wet pavement. A chopper swept overhead, its spotlight slicing the dark like a blade. Her breath stayed steady. Her nerves, steel. Two beat cops rounded the corner, radios crackling. Black female, 30s, gray suit, armed and dangerous. She flattened against a brick wall, clutching her files tighter. They had no idea the only weapon she carried was the truth. A man in a trucker hat squinted at her from across the sidewalk. "That's her," he muttered, dialing his phone. "Yeah, I see that crazy woman from the news." Figueroa and 8th. Alina bolted. Her heels echoed against the street, weaving through a crowd gathered around a taco stand. Someone screamed, "It's the terrorist!" A teenager snapped a photo. Flash. Sirens wailed. Tires screeched. Police cruisers boxed her in. She veered into a parking garage, the concrete walls swallowing her whole. The sound of shouting echoed, every voice a threat, every stranger a weapon. Dominic's lie had turned an entire city into his army. And he stood in his hotel suite, silhouetted against the city lights, his 6'2" frame looming like a specter of power. A TV blared behind him. Suspect Alina Cross linked to violent assault on a private jet remains at large. Dominic's grin returned. His fingers cracked. You'll run. But not for long. The doctored footage, spliced from Reed Dalton's original, was everywhere now. But twisted. Alina Cross's defense had been edited into an attack. And the public? They swallowed it. Whole. Comments flooded every platform. Lock her up. She's dangerous. Disgrace to the country. Each one a dagger carefully sharpened by Dominic Rourke. He'd lost the jet, lost the sheriff, but this was checkmate. She'd be hunted, broken, erased. On a dark side street in downtown L.A., Alina crouched behind a parked van. Her gray suit, now dusty, merged with the shadows as the chopper's beam swept overhead. Footsteps pounded nearby. 2 cops, guns drawn. "She's close," one barked. Their radios crackled. "Suspect heading north. Approach with caution." Alina slid off her heels, the shoes silent as death in her hands. Barefoot now, she darted toward a stairwell, her breath low, her mind razor-sharp. She pulled a burner phone from her bag, one she'd snagged from the jet, and punched in a string of numbers she hadn't dialed in years. The line clicked. A familiar voice answered. Jax, her old hacker friend, a digital ghost in the machine. "It's me," she whispered. "I'm tagged. I need a broadcast. Now." Jax didn't hesitate. "Give me 10. Alina nodded. Her smirk flickered back. 10 minutes was all she needed. She climbed to a rooftop overlooking the city's endless sprawl. Below, red and blue lights painted the streets. A chopper veered close. Its beam missed her by inches. She ducked behind a rusted AC unit, heart steady. A pickup truck roared past, its driver yelling, "I'll find her!" A shotgun gleamed in his hand. Dominic's viral lie had turned the city into a hunting ground, a vigilante playground. But she wasn't out yet. 10 minutes. Then it hit. Every screen in Los Angeles, from sports bars to skyscraper billboards, flickered, then cut to black, and then her voice filled the air. "This is Alina Cross. Dominic Rourke framed me. Here's the truth. The unedited footage rolled, Reed's raw video, the takedown in the jet, Alina saving lives, Dominic's racist tirades echoing through high-def speakers. He's the threat," she said, "not me." Her gray suit blazed under the city's lights, a new symbol of justice. The effect was instant. Traffic stopped. Cops froze, radios crackling to silence. Vigilantes lowered their weapons, confused. Hashtags flipped, saw Naya Truth surged. Victor lies caught fire. In his penthouse suite, Dominic watched in horror. He hurled his whiskey glass at the TV. It shattered into 100 shards. "No!" he howled, his voice breaking. His phone buzzed. Panic from his tech team. "It's everywhere. We can't stop it." Dominic's face turned purple with rage, his empire of deceit collapsing beneath him. Alina had hijacked the narrative. She turned his manhunt into her microphone. Support poured in. Tweets, calls, shouts of solidarity. Back on the rooftop, Alina slipped into the crowd unnoticed. The helicopter above veered off. The pilot spoke over the comm. "Stand down. Subject clear." Cops holstered their weapons. The net had unraveled. Alina slid her heels back on, her posture tall, her smirk unshakable. Dominic's face glowed red from the light of the broadcast. His voice, a bitter whisper. "You think this is over?" He yanked out his burner phone, fingers flying. "Take Dalton. Kill him. Make her surrender." He hit send. His grin came back, twisted, desperate. She might have taken the skies, but he'd take her heart. The city buzzed. Car horns honked in celebration. Supporters filled social feeds. Alina faded into the crowd, her files clutched tight. Reed's phone rang. Her number, no answer. She was moving, planning. The manhunt dissolved. The vigilantes disappeared. Even the cops began doubting the story, and Dominic Rourke, in his darkened suite, realized his trap had sprung. But the wrong one had walked into it. Alina's voice looped across every device, a beacon, a blade. But his next blow was already on its way. Reed Dalton was in his crosshairs, and Dominic Rourke wasn't done until Alina bled. Midnight blanketed Los Angeles in a hush that felt anything but calm. Alina Cross moved like a shadow through the city's forgotten veins, alleys laced with steam, streets humming with distant sirens. Her gray suit, now smudged and torn, clung to her like old armor. Her backpack, slung over one shoulder, held the same stack of files that had survived the jet, and nearly everything since. She approached a warehouse on the edge of Skid Row, its corrugated walls rusted like dried blood, windows shattered, the neon glow of downtown flickering miles behind her. Victor Rourke's latest blow had landed. Reed Dalton, her ally from the jet, her witness, her proof, was gone, snatched, held, and now used. A live stream buzzed on her burner phone, the screen jittering with static. Then it locked into focus. Dominic Rourke, live. "You've got 1 hour, Alina," he sneered. The camera panned to Reed, bound and bloodied, a gag pressed deep into his mouth. His eyes dazed but pleading. A gun pressed to his temple. Surrender, or he's done. Alina's breath slowed, her deep brown eyes hardened. No smirk, no quip, only steel. Inside, Dominic stalked the oil-stained floor. His 6'2" frame loomed under buzzing fluorescence. Around him, his loyal shadows moved, Vance, scarred and silent. 2 more, hulking men with dead eyes and gleaming pistols. Reed sat slumped in a wooden chair, zip ties cutting into his wrists. Blood streaked down his cheek. The live stream camera blinked red on a tripod, broadcasting to the world. A public execution staged as theater. "You think you're untouchable?" Dominic barked into the lens. "Come get your hero, or I'll paint this floor with him." His words burned with racial venom. "Time to remind you where you belong, on your knees." Outside, Alina crouched by a shattered window, her breath low, her gaze scanning the chaos. She spotted Reed, barely conscious. She spotted Dominic, raging. Then her phone buzzed. "Jax. Cops are 30 minutes out. You're on your own." She nodded once, slipping the burner away. Fine. She'd finish this herself. She peeled open her backpack and pulled out a toolkit, compact, precise, and familiar. A coil of wire, a flashlight, a screwdriver. Her hands were steady, her eyes locked. Dominic wanted a trap? She'd flip it. Inside, Dominic kicked Reed's chair. The wood groaned. Reed whimpered behind the gag. "Your savior's running scared," he taunted the camera. "She's nothing without her tricks." Vance chuckled, adjusting the grip on his pistol. The goons swept the warehouse, boots echoing like drumbeats in a funeral march. Alina circled the building's side, barefoot now, her steps silent on gravel. She reached a rusted metal door. The lock creaked, but her screwdriver twisted it free with a soft click. She slipped inside. The air was damp, bitter, like decay, like a trap waiting to be torn apart. She moved through the dark like vapor, slipping behind stacked crates, flashlight off. She didn't need light. She needed control. Her eyes caught a power box on the far wall. Wires exposed. Vulnerable. She smiled for the first time in an hour. Behind her, Vance's boots pounded past, so close she could feel the floor hum beneath his weight. Dominic's voice boomed. 40 minutes, Alina! Tick-tock. He slammed a fist into Reed's shoulder, a muffled cry, a camera flash, an audience watching live. Alina's fingers danced. She cracked open the power box, spliced wires, rerouted current, rigged a spark to trigger on command. An old trick from her engineering days, back before this war. Dominic wanted a finale? She'd deliver an act of God. She crept behind a rusted forklift, her silhouette swallowed by shadow. Across the warehouse, Dominic ranted louder. "You're a plague, Cross. You think you can ruin me? I'll bury you. And your little friend." His voice echoed, but his hour was ticking away. And Alina Cross? She was about to flip the script. Kindness had no place in that warehouse. Not now. not with Dominic Rourke snarling poison and hate. His thick fists clenched, his voice a tidal wave of racial bile, his shadow looming over Reed Dalton, ready to finish the job. And that's when Alina Cross struck. She flipped the switch. The warehouse plunged into darkness. Then, boom! A rigged flash ignited near Dominic's armed men. They yelped, guns flailing in panic, their vision blasted white. Alina became a shadow in the chaos. She darted forward, her wire coil whipping low. She looped it around Vance's ankle, just as he staggered past. One yank, crash, his scarred face slammed into the floor. His pistol skidded into the shadows. The goons fired wildly, bullets pinging off rusted metal, but Alina was gone, already slicing Reed's zip ties with her screwdriver, ripping the gag away. "Run!" she whispered, her voice sharp, fierce, and final. She shoved him toward the side exit as Dominic's roar cracked through the dark. "She's here!" He snatched up a fallen pistol. The livestream camera tipped sideways as he kicked the tripod in rage. Reed stumbled, barely upright. Alina pushed him again. Her gray suit became a blur of motion as the warehouse lights flickered back, dim, flickering. They revealed Vance groaning on the floor, the others disoriented, and Dominic standing tall, his gun trained on her. "You're dead!" he bellowed. The gunshot cracked. Alina's shoulder jerked back, blood blooming through her sleeve, but she didn't fall, didn't even blink. She smirked, just a flicker, and vanished behind a crate. Outside, Reed collapsed onto the gravel. Sirens wailed in the distance. 20 minutes out. Inside, Alina rolled, pain spiking down her arm. She grabbed a metal pipe and hurled it at Dominic. It struck his wrist with a sharp crack, sending the gun tumbling. He charged her. His massive body slammed into her, pinning her to a crate. "You're nothing," he hissed, breath reeking of whiskey and hate, his hands clawing for her throat. She twisted, kneed him in the gut, and slipped free as he doubled over. The livestream kept rolling, capturing every frame, the villain raging, the woman fighting back. The comment section exploded. "She's fighting back! He's a monster!" Alina dove, scooping up the gun. Vance staggered up, bloody and dazed. She aimed. "Down!" she ordered, her voice like ice. Vance froze. The others lowered their weapons, confusion dawning. Dominic wheezed on the floor, clutching his ribs, staring up at her with bloodshot rage. "You can't win," he spat. "I already have," she said. Her shoulder bled, her hand steady, and the world watched. The livestream captured it all, her victory in real time. Dominic's threat turned into a broadcasted confession. But then, he pulled a detonator from his pocket. A last card, a final horror. "If I go down, we all go down." He slammed his thumb onto the trigger. The floor rumbled. Dust cascaded. Alina's eyes widened. She grabbed Reed, tackled him out the door. Boom! The warehouse exploded behind them. Flames reached for the sky. Metal screamed. Debris shot like bullets. They hit the gravel hard. Alina's suit scorched, her breath ragged, the fire behind them a hell they just escaped. Dominic's scream was lost in the roar. The live stream cut to static. But he'd done it. Again. The narrative twisted, a warehouse in flames, the footage gone. Alina, once again, framed. Sirens screamed closer, 5 minutes out. Alina pulled Reed to his feet. Blood ran down her arm. Her eyes burned. "We're not done," she muttered. They vanished into the shadows. Dawn painted Los Angeles in bruised hues as Alina and Reed limped across a scrub-dotted field. Behind them, the warehouse burned, a symbol of her victory, and the next chapter of her blame. She was no longer a fugitive. Now, she was a terrorist, and the final battle hadn't even begun. Alina Cross wasn't running. Not anymore. The skyline was jagged. Towers stabbed the pale dawn while helicopters swept the foggy skies, their lights slashing the horizon. But the real danger wasn't above. It was coming from all sides. Sirens screamed from distant highways. Media vans gridlocked roads with headlines howling like alarms. Terror in L.A., fugitive consultant Alina Cross behind bombing. Dominic Rourke's final trick, blowing up the warehouse and stitching her into the crime, had worked, at least for now. The doctored narrative spread like wildfire, with anchors repeating each other's fear-fueled spin. She's unhinged, radicalized, a threat to the American way. Alina's face, sharp in her now filthy gray suit, glared from every broadcast. The same woman who saved a jet full of people was now branded the face of domestic terror. She tossed her scorched burner phone into a ditch and dragged Reed Dalton behind a rusted billboard off the service road. Her shoulder screamed from the bullet wound, but her voice didn't tremble. They're closing in. Reed nodded, pale and rattled. They think you lit the fuse. Dominic isn't finished, she said, her eyes scanning the dusty ridgeline. But neither are we. On cue, a fleet of unmarked black SUVs tore across the field, FBI agents in armored vests spilling out, rifles raised, boots pounding the dirt. The air buzzed with rotors as two choppers dipped low, kicking up clouds of grit. Over a megaphone, the call thundered, "Alina Cross! Surrender now!" Reed clutched his phone like a lifeline. "They'll shoot," he whispered. "They think you're armed." "Let them think it," Alina replied. "Just get the truth out." Inside a hotel suite not far away, Dominic Rourke slouched on a velvet couch, basking in his own deceit. Broken glass littered the floor from the tantrum he'd thrown earlier. His bruised knuckles curled around a phone, eyes gleaming as messages rolled in. Warehouse pinned on her. "You're clear." He grinned, wide, smug, hollow. "They'll never forgive her now," he muttered. "She's the villain. I'm the survivor." Back in the field, Agent Kessler, buzz-cut and sharp-eyed, barked from behind a tactical shield. "She's armed. If she moves, take the shot." The profile wasn't subtle. Her race, her refusal to back down, it all fed the script Dominic had written for her. Alina huddled lower behind the billboard, her breath shallow, her shoulders sticky with blood. "Your phone," she said to Reed, nodding toward his pocket. He fumbled with trembling fingers, the screen flickering. No signal. She snatched it gently, fingers tapping fast. One of Jax's tricks, a hidden hotspot protocol. The upload connected, barely. "Come on," she whispered, eyes darting to the rifle scopes. The video began transmitting, slow, agonizing. Uncut jet footage, the sabotage, the fight, Dominic's slurs, the warehouse. The bar inched up. 40 yards. 35. "Last warning," Kessler shouted. A sniper's red dot slid across the billboard, dancing inches from her cheek. Reed looked ready to cry. "We're done," he muttered. But Alina, steady, focused. Upload 95%, 100%. She tapped send. Los Angeles lit up like a circuit board. Screens flickered, billboards flashed, TVs cut to black. Then her voice rolled out like thunder. "Dominic Rourke bombed that warehouse. Not me. Here's your proof. Every angle played. Dominic's commands, his men with guns, her fixing the oxygen, saving the passengers, surviving the trap." The world watched. Drivers honked. Pedestrians stopped mid-stride. Agent Kessler paused, hand to his earpiece. His face twitched. "Stand down. Do it now." The rifles lowered. The snipers backed off. Helicopters banked away. The noose Dominic tied unraveled in seconds. Social feeds flipped. Mayor Cross-truth surged. Rourke lies exploded. Inside his suite, Dominic saw it unfold. Alina's broadcast looped on his TV, her bleeding but defiant, truth cutting through his empire of deceit. "No," he screamed. He hurled a crystal lamp into the screen. Sparks sprayed. His face twisted in rage. Everything he built, crashing. Again. But Alina wasn't smiling. She knew him. She knew he had one more move. He fell, but not quietly. Dominic Rourke's face flushed a violent shade of red as the weight of his crumbling empire crushed him. His thick hands clawed at the air, his breath ragged. The burner phone in his palm buzzed one final warning. "Feds moving. Hotel breached. You're exposed." He staggered back, a beast in a corner, fury choking him. Outside his luxury suite, sirens howled, doors slammed, his escape? Gone. Across the city, Alina Cross stood in the rising dawn, her tattered gray suit catching the morning light like a battle flag. Blood seeped from her shoulder, but she stood tall, shoulder to shoulder with Reed Dalton, who clutched the phone that had shattered every one of Dominic's lies. FBI agent Kessler approached slowly, face hard as granite. His voice dropped. "You're cleared. Rourke's in custody." Alina nodded once. No celebration. Not yet. Across the field, former passengers watched from a distance. Estelle Drayton, stoic. Clara, misty-eyed. Philip Raines, phone buzzing with breaking news alerts. Dominic Rourke, arrested. Domestic terrorism charges pending. Reed's phone still rolled, the footage now proof. The world had seen it. Victor's empire had cracked. But in a holding cell, Dominic wasn't done. "Get me Lancaster," he snarled into a smuggled line, breath hot through barred teeth. "Take Titan back, smear her, vote her out." His voice echoed off steel. A final move, a corporate ambush. Even in cuffs he played dirty. By noon, downtown Los Angeles shimmered under a brutal sun. The Titan Industries tower stood like a blade in the sky, glass walls gleaming, the pulse of Rourke's poisoned legacy still beating within. Inside, Alina crossed the marble lobby, bandaged and bruised, but fierce. Her heels echoed off stone as she climbed. Beside her, Reed limped but steady, his phone a weapon more powerful than any pistol. The 30th floor boardroom awaited, a palace of polished oak, steel, and hostility. 8 executives sat at a crescent table, suits pressed, expressions colder than chrome. Leading them, Harold Vance, hawk-nosed, pale, and perched like a vulture at the head of the table, a relic of Rourke's rule. He stood without welcome. "Cross," he said, voice dry and bitter. "You're done here. The board voted. You're out." Papers shuffled. A forged memo slid forward, unfit for leadership. The ink still wet with Dominic's hate. Alina didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her gray suit ragged, blood on the sleeve, but her spine unbroken. Her voice was calm, clear and cutting. "Voted? Without me. That's cute." Reed stepped beside her and dropped his phone on the table. The screen flared to life, dark but loaded. Harold smirked. "We've reviewed the chaos," he said. "Violence, explosions, public disgrace. This company won't survive a scandal tied to someone like—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The room reeked of veiled threats and old money. Margaret Thorndale, pearls gleaming, pursed her lips. "Your presence alone has become a liability," she muttered. Richard Mathers, balding and smug, leaned forward. "We're protecting Titan. You're not Titan." "But Alina?" She smiled, that same smirk that had shattered Dominic in the skies, the one that said, "You're playing the wrong game." She pressed her palms flat on the table and leaned in. "While Dominic chased power, I fixed what he broke. While you poured champagne in jets, I built the systems that kept them in the air." She let that land hard. You want to lock someone out? Try the man in cuffs, not the woman who saved your empire. Harold Vance leaned back, his face stiff with arrogance. "Security's on their way," he sneered. "You're finished." Around the table, the board members sat smug and composed, cloaked in privilege. Dominic Rourke's prison call had armed them with lies. A smear campaign, a whisper of radical. Their weapon wasn't new, just unspoken. Until now. Reed Dalton bristled, his hand inching toward his phone, but Alina Cross raised a hand to stop him. She wasn't going anywhere. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. 2 black-clad guards burst in, batons ready, faces hard. "Ma'am, let's go!" one barked. A warning, a threat, but Alina stood her ground, her voice rising, not in fear, but authority. "Check your email, Harold." A tense beat, then a ping. Harold's fingers trembled as he tapped his tablet. His smirk vanished, His skin turned to ash. "What is this?" he choked. "Ownership," Alina said, straightening her bloodied gray suit like armor. "I purchased controlling shares in Titan 3 years ago. Quietly, legally. This is my boardroom." Chaos exploded. Margaret Thorndale gasped, her pearl necklace rattling against her blouse. Richard Mathers slammed a fist on the table. "That's impossible!" he shouted, but the digital seal glowed on Harold's screen, official, time-stamped, and irrefutable. Alina Cross, majority shareholder, CEO. The guards froze, batons lowered. Reed's phone lit up, a glowing screen full of truth. He played the jet footage, Dominic's racist rant, Alina's heroics, the warehouse inferno she barely escaped. "She's the boss," he said flatly. The red light on the phone blinked like justice itself. Alina stepped closer to the table, her presence swallowing the room. "You thought Dominic's little coup would break me? I've owned you from the start." Harold lunged across the table, his gaunt frame shaking as he shoved the tablet toward her. "This is fraud!" he shrieked. Margaret stood, finger pointing. "You're a thug in a suit, unfit!" The racism wasn't subtle anymore. It was loud, raw. Dominic's echo in every word. Alina didn't blink. "Unfit?" she said, voice like ice. "I saved Titan from the fire you helped start. Planes, bombs, lives, you watched it happen." The guards stepped aside. Their radios crackled. Dominic Rourke booked. Federal charges pending. Cross-verified as legal CEO. Reality struck. Harold wilted. Margaret's pearls stilled. Richard muttered, "We're finished." The guards nodded. She was in charge now. Alina sat, cool, commanding. "Call security if you want," she said, "but they report to me now." The board fell silent. Tom's footage looped again, Dominic screaming, "Put her in her place." Her answer, calm, strategic, fearless. But just as calm returned, Harold's tablet pinged again. A fresh alert. Legal notice. "He's suing you," Harold rasped, that familiar smirk crawling back, claiming fraud, threats, says you stole Titan, a forged lawsuit filed from a prison cell. Dominic's last venom planted hours before his fall. The board perked up, desperate. Margaret nodded. "She'll fall in court." Richard clung to the memo like a lifeline. Alina stood. Her shoulder burned. Her voice didn't shake. "Let him try," she said, a whisper that hit like a hammer. "I've buried him before." Reed tucked his phone away, his grin fierce. The footage? Untouchable. The boardroom? Hers. The suits shrank beneath her gaze. Harold's hands dropped. Margaret's pearls didn't move. Richard's paper crumpled in his sweaty palm. Outside, news vans circled like moths to a flame. The Chiron flashed. "Alina Cross takes Titan." Victor's echo? Fading. But not finished. In a jail cell across town, Dominic gripped the bars, his face wild with fury. His final move? This lawsuit, his last war. Alina stood at the center of the storm. Titan was hers. But the courtroom loomed next, Los Angeles bathed in golden dusk as Alina Cross stepped out of the courthouse, her gray suit tattered but regal. The stitches and bandages couldn't dim the fire in her deep brown eyes. The cameras flashed like fireworks around her, reporters calling her name, microphones lunging forward. Beside her stood Reed Dalton, his bruises healing, his phone a symbol of truth, the very tool that unraveled a tyrant. Inside, the judge's gavel had just fallen. Dominic Rourke's final play? Shattered. His forged lawsuit, dismissing Alina as a fraud, a thief, crumbled under the weight of ironclad documents. 3 years ago, she had silently secured majority ownership of Titan Industries. Contracts, transfers, seals, legal, impeccable, undeniable. She was now CEO, unchallenged. Titan was hers. Miles away, in a concrete cell that reeked of bleach and regret, Dominic slumped against steel bars. His once imposing frame sagged in an orange jumpsuit. The TV mounted high above blared the ruling. Case dismissed. Ms. Alina Cross is the rightful owner of Titan Industries. Each word slashed deeper than prison bars ever could. The jet footage, his warehouse detonation, his racist rants, all public, all damning, and none of it could be undone. Back on the courthouse steps, Alina walked to the podium. The city hushed. "I didn't just win," she said, her voice steady. "I planned this." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. She revealed the truth. She'd been watching Dominic rot Titan from the inside for years. She bought the company silently, waited, let him fester, every slur, every scheme, every failed trap. She turned them into bricks in his coffin. "He built my case for me," she said, her smirk breaking through like sunlight. "This was always my jet." Dominic's cell TV played her speech in a loop. He roared, pounded the wall. But no one came. His empire, gone. His name, poison. His legacy, buried under the feet of the woman he tried to destroy. Alina turned, walking away from the courthouse. Her heels clicked like war drums. Her gray suit, once stained with sabotage and fire, now flew like a banner of victory. Behind her, the skyline lit up. The city she reclaimed.